Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, April 16th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the governor and Senate elections that are in swing and competitive states for the 2022 midterm elections, and how the Republican Party still has not had clear frontrunners in many of these extremely competitive races. Now, I made a video about a month back talking about how this was ultimately going to be harmful to the GOP, and I stand by that point. I think the Republican Party is in a position right now where this is their midterm to lose. The Democratic Party might be in the majority, but truly speaking, you are talking about a race in which the House majority is out there by 5, meaning you win 5 and you win the House majority. The Senate seats, you only need 1, and then the governorships, you already have an advantage that you need to just simply maintain. The Democratic Party is in a position where many of their nominees in a bunch of states have already been solidified. You've seen party endorsements. You've seen frontrunner statuses established for many, many contenders. And when I look at the Republican side, I'm simply not seeing it happen. Now, the reason why that is so important is because we are now in a position where we are getting right into the primary season. And if we come into this primary and there is a random GOP nominee that wins, nobody really knows exactly, number one, who that candidate is, because you're probably not seeing a lot of name-wide recognition if they aren't already the frontrunner status. But in addition to that, I think you are going to find that the Republican Party is going to find themselves in a position where they really didn't know who was going to win entering into these primaries. Knowing who your candidate is going to be allows you to start campaigning with such candidate, to start focusing on your opponents. Looking at the state of Georgia, Stacey Abrams has been the presumptive nominee since the moment she announced her bid. In Texas, Beto O'Rourke has been the presumptive nominee since the moment he announced, and knowing that, he can now go completely on the offense against his Republican opponents. Now, in the state of Texas, Greg Abbott is more than likely going to win, but in the Georgia governor's race, we actually don't know who's going to win. Instead of targeting Stacey Abrams that you actually might expect from the incumbent Republican governor, and while he is doing that, he is also fighting his own battles, his own internal battles within the GOP. David Perdue is holding rallies, coming out there and saying, Brian Kemp is not the right candidate. You are finding that his own party is turning on him. And that isn't the only state. Those are certainly not individual examples. The Republican Party is up by 2.3% nationwide. Adjusting for Republican, uncertainty vote here, you're probably talking about a 5-point lead nationally. The GOP maintains their advantage because Joe Biden is unpopular, inflation is high, gas prices are rising, and the international conflicts aren't helping Joe Biden like some people might have expected. And I think this really adds into this idea that the midterm elections aren't going to go in favor of the Democratic Party, no matter how hard they try. I think they will very much sustain what they have in the House. I don't think you're going to see 2014 levels in terms of losses or numbers for the Democratic Party. I expect them to hover around the low 200s. But I do think, while the Democratic Party might be able to be resilient on that end, the GOP undoubtedly will win control of the House, will win control of the Senate, but it doesn't come easy. And they certainly aren't making it easier for themselves. I was scrolling through a lot of these latest polls from Real Clear Politics, as one does. I spend a lot of my time just looking at individual data. And while there is some data here and some news that I would like to cover in a future video, one thing has become increasingly more evident as I go through the governor election polls and the Senate election polls. Let's start with the Senate per se. The Pennsylvania Senate race right here from the Trafalgar Group, what we find is that Dr. Oz is only ahead by 3 points. In the Ohio Senate race, the Republican primary here, Josh Mandel is only ahead by 5. In the North Carolina Senate race, Ted Budd is only ahead by 10. If you're looking down further, what you'll find is that other polls actually show differing numbers from the Pennsylvania Senate race. If you continue to look, you will find a lot of competitiveness in the Pennsylvania Senate election yet again, another tie. You're continuing on and on and on, and what you'll find is that Missouri is close and competitive as well. Alabama is close and competitive as well. But Alabama obviously doesn't matter as much, some other states do. But competitive primaries right now tell us that the GOP doesn't have a solidified nominee, and that's not necessarily a good thing. The Democratic Party, if you look at some of their polls that you're counteracting this with, you will find that they seem to have at least a clear frontrunner. In the state of Pennsylvania, what you find is that John Fetterman consistently leads by somewhere around 20 to 30 points, and he very much is the frontrunner and more than likely going to win that primary. You move on to other elections. Democrats also are down in the Senate Democratic primary in Alabama, but again, an entirely inconsequential state. My point being that if you look across the nation, Democrats have very much solidified their nominees. For instance, you look at Georgia, they have an incumbent. You take a look at Pennsylvania, you have John Fetterman, who's in the lead. You take a look at Ohio, Tim Ryan is the presumptive nominee. Take a look at North Carolina, Sherry Beasley ahead by 33 points. You take a look at Nevada, you have an incumbent. Take a look at other states, you have incumbents, you have noticeable names, and you have people that very much have established themselves as a frontrunner. And I think that's really where we now enter into a tricky position for the Republican Party, that the Democratic Party, despite being the party that was very much expected to have trouble fielding candidates, getting people on the ballot. They simply aren't having that problem to the same extent that the GOP is. And we can continue over and see very similar results in the governor elections. Now, on one hand, I would say, Brian Kemp being up 24 points, that's impressive. But in terms of the rest of the data, he's only up by an average of about 12 points. As an incumbent governor, that's not a good result. And keep in mind, typically the Trump vote is typically underperformed and underrepresented in opinion polling data. I think David Perdue actually might be at a little bit of a higher point than we are expecting. But regardless, the average is a 12-point lead for an incumbent against someone who just lost a race statewide. The Pennsylvania governor's race, what you find is that Lou Barletta, even though he was the 2018 nominee for Senate, can't seem to get above 19% in the most recent poll. He's losing to Mastriano by 3 points statewide, but no real main difference here. You're talking about numbers within the margin of error. Even the Ohio governor's race, what you have is Mike DeWine as the incumbent Republican governor is only hovering around 14 points. Kemp up by 11. You take a look at other data. Barletta up by 4. Pennsylvania, again, Michigan governor, Craig, up by 18 points, but nothing super substantial per se. Even though he is a front runner in the sense that he's up 18 points, he's hovering around just 1/3 of the vote, and he's a name that should be extremely recognizable across the state, especially in the Detroit metro area. So looking at a lot of this data, I have sort of solidified on some states where I really don't think the GOP has the front runner status that they very much need, that Democrats very much do. Looking at the Senate elections, you might be thrown off by some of these lighter red states. I thought for a brief period of time that I would just show you some of the states where the GOP has fielded the right candidates. They, of course, have incumbents in all of the safe states, but I decided that it would be too much time to actually talk through them because the point of this video is to show the faults of the GOP, not necessarily show that they are doing some things right. I think they are doing things right in many states, but that's the bare minimum. They are the party that is going into this with every expectation to reclaim the majority, meaning that people should be eager to run, and there should be presumptive nominees already. And I also do want to say, we are not addressing the elephant in the room until now. President Donald Trump has made many endorsements. For instance, in the Georgia governor's race, Donald Trump endorsed David Perdue. In the Pennsylvania Senate race, Donald Trump endorsed Dr. Oz. If you're taking a look across the nation, you are finding that President Trump has given endorsements in many of these races. In the Republican primary here in North Carolina, he gave Ted Budd his endorsement about 9 months ago. 10 months ago, probably. You are looking at states that have had Trump endorsements for quite some time, and they still can't seem to pick a presumptive nominee. And looking at the governor elections and the Senate elections here, what you are finding is that these states are the most competitive ones. Republicans lucked out with incumbents in Vermont and New Hampshire and endorsements in Maryland that seem to propel and prop up Republicans that they expect and want to win the Republican primaries. You have Wisconsin, you have Minnesota, where Republicans seem to be at least coalesced around a candidate. I don't see much out of Minnesota, but truly I don't think it's going to be as competitive as some of these other states that we are currently addressing. But my point being, that I look at this data and I find that the Republican Party doesn't have fielded or top tier or even front runner status candidates in many of these races, whereas you have Democrats across all of them. You have a Democrat in Nevada, the incumbent governor. You have Katie Hobbs, the Secretary of State in Arizona. You have the incumbent governor in the state of Michigan. Now, when it comes down to the Democratic primary for governor in the state of Pennsylvania, there isn't an incumbent that is running. Tom Wolf is retiring, but you do have Josh Shapiro, who is the Attorney General of the state and has already received the endorsement of the Pennsylvania Democratic Party and has already pivoted to the general election months ago. And what you have in Ohio is actually a tricky situation there. I don't think Democrats are as solidified, but in Georgia, you have Stacey Abrams. My point being that the Republican Party is going to be months behind when it comes down to the final campaign. And while they still will very much have the upper hand because of the national stances, because of where Joe Biden is, because of where these individual candidates are, and they very well might luck out. My problem is that they could already be doing so much more damage to the Democratic Party, and I simply don't see it happening. And I don't see it happening because Republicans don't have their candidates in place. You look at Michigan and you say, there should be someone who the Michigan Republican Party should have thought of and said, this is probably going to be one of the most competitive races. When you look at the history in Michigan, you find that Biden only won the state by 2.8. This is absolutely a state that can be targeted. In Pennsylvania, it's a state that Donald Trump won in 2016, Joe Biden won in 2020. Absolutely is a prime target, but you have a popular attorney general who actually outperformed Biden in 2020. That is the Democratic nominee, and yet the GOP can't seem to provide and pick a good candidate, at least yet. Looking at Ohio, you have an incumbent governor who can't seem to be breaking out of this competitive primary. Same thing in Georgia. You have a Trump-endorsed candidate in Arizona who can't seem to make headway across the polls despite President Trump actively campaigning with and for her. And the same thing comes to the state of Nevada. Ultimately, the problem lies in the Republican Party candidates here and their own institutions for not making it easier for some of these Republicans to propel to victory. Because you find Democrats in many of these competitive races easily winning their primaries, landsliding their opponents right now, and they are going to be the nominees. Democrats have been given months in advance on campaigning because the GOP can't figure out their own stuff. You have Arizona, extremely competitive, Nevada, Georgia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, all swing states from 2020. Yet the GOP is falling behind. In the Senate elections, it doesn't get much better. Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, amongst the states that we expect to be the closest. Nevada has an incumbent Democrat. Arizona has an incumbent Democrat. Pennsylvania, Democrats have John Fetterman. North Carolina, Democrats have Sherry Beasley. Georgia, Democrats have an incumbent. When it comes down to Ohio and Missouri, it's a bit trickier because in Ohio we know it's going to be Tim Ryan, but Missouri is the tricky situation because Democrats don't exactly have this top-tier fielded candidate, but it's also Missouri. It's a state that Donald Trump won by 15 points in 2020 and by nearly 20 in 2016. Looking at Missouri right now, the reason why I even talk about this as a swing state is because there is a potential nominee here called Eric Greens, the former governor of the state, who resigned amidst scandals dealing with his family and his wife. And you find these revitalized because actually more data and more information came out about him and the way that he treated his wife. And in that treatment, you find multiple GOP names calling on him to withdraw himself from the race, to drop. And they called on him to resign before, and he actually did. Now, in his resignation, he didn't really indicate that he planned on running for future office, but by resigning and being already a statewide elected official, governor, in 2016, you found that he made a very big name for himself across the state. He only won by about 6 points, but he still was able to win in the state of Missouri. But if he should be the Republican nominee, that race will be competitive. And I think that's one thing that I'm surprised to see, that knowing just how poorly he performs in opinion polling data and everything else, he still seems to be about 1 point behind the current leader of the polls, leader of the state of Missouri when it comes down to the Republican primary. That very narrow lead isn't enough for me to say that that is a solidified primary at all. Yet it could be one of the more competitive races should that 1 point behind candidate, end up winning. Should Eric Greens be that nominee, it could be competitive. The GOP really needs to find a way beyond Donald Trump to try to change the way that we are looking at these primaries, because some of these primaries are going to occur in June, July, and August. And every moment leading up till then, the Democrats will be out campaigning in full force. And while the Republican Party, again, to reiterate, very much has the advantage and very well could luck out, it makes it so much more difficult when you have a party against you, as an incumbent party or not, actively campaigning and dissuading voters while you're still busy fighting people within your own party. While you're still busy going to primary debates, this Democratic candidate is going to arenas, going to canvas spots, going to different parts of the state and campaigning for themselves and solely for themselves and not against another Democrat. I think the Republican Party now needs to look at this and say, in the future, they need to jump on these endorsements earlier. They need to get some top names out there, and President Trump very clearly was not enough in many of these states. His endorsement in some of these states has been lasting for 9-10 months. Yet you can't seem to find his nominee of choice to be leading by exceptional amounts. Sometimes they do lead and sometimes they lose. It's very interesting to see the dynamic. But I think the Republican Party is now in a tricky position where I think a lot of people saw 2022 as an opportunity. And because so many people saw it as an opportunity, they never really cleared the field. They never really sat down all these Republican candidates and say, hey, it can only be one of you, and we will decide which one who is best for the GOP. I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that there's a lot of political opportunism. You see Dr. Oz in the state of Pennsylvania, where some of the top Republicans there are saying, no, he cannot be our Senate nominee because he can't win, and he's also doing this out of political opportunity. He lives in New Jersey, he should not be representing our state, and they are going against him and endorsing David McCormick. Well, you have endorsements from McCormick from top GOP names, you have Donald Trump endorsing Dr. Oz, and thus, because you have conflicting names and conflicting endorsements, you are looking at a primary where one candidate might be up by 3 and sometimes be down by 5. And it's a primary that has multiple candidates and people who really have no shot at the Republican primary who are still running simply because they think 2022 could be their year. And the GOP isn't doing anything to prevent that. I'm not trying to say that they should at all intimidate candidates or prevent people from running, but I am trying to say that they should have a realistic conversation with many of these people and say, not all of you can be the next senator from the state of Pennsylvania. You can fight for it, do whatever you want, but they should have made an endorsement. They should have made it clear who should be this front runner. Because I think looking at it in terms of an electability standpoint, in terms of, who is able to win and who is able to, turn out the vote and actually double down on this Republican lead nationwide, some of these people are in 4th to 5th place statewide, simply because the GOP didn't intervene and President Trump already did, and yet you still aren't seeing very clear frontrunner statuses for all of these states in red in some extremely, extremely competitive and important races for 2022. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.